This is the new Nikon ZF. It is a full-frame, retro-inspired camera that combines a 24 megapixel sensor with the processor that we saw in the Z8. This camera delivers interesting options for photographers who prefer the vintage aesthetic combined with one of the most powerful autofocus systems that you can find on the market. Welcome back, everyone. In this video, we are going to be talking about the brand new Nikon ZF. Now, before I get into this, I do want to talk about my experience with this camera. So the way it works with Nikon pre-releases, they called me a few weeks back and they said, would you like to check out the new ZF? I said, are you kidding? I would love to check it out. So the way that Nikon roll when they do these is they actually have to send somebody out with the camera to spend the entire day with you, which is fine. It's better than not having any time with it at all. So this is kind of a first impressions based on a long day of use with this, where I got all my B-roll and all my sample images in one day. But I can say this, it is very impressive. So this is not the Nikon ZF, this is a Nikon FE2, and I brought this out because the design on the ZF pretty much takes all of its cues from cameras that were big in the 70s and the 80s. So things like the FM series of cameras or the FE series of cameras, they were awesome cameras. And I really like seeing Nikon bring this direction back. The other thing that's really cool about it is that it means you're gonna get actual physical dials and buttons on your camera, which is something that in the digital era we've strayed away from somewhat. So it's really nice to see that back. I was really excited to get to use this camera and it did not disappoint. So I wanna talk about my experience with it. I wanna show you some images, but real quick, let's talk about the specs that we're dealing with. The Nikon ZF has a 24 megapixel backside illuminated CMOS sensor. It is not a stack sensor, and the camera does utilize a mechanical shutter, but we have the new X-Speed 7 processor, so the autofocus performance is going to be pretty much on par with what we saw with the Z8. This means we've got 9 different types of subject recognition. It features 3D tracking, and the camera can detect faces as small as 3% of the image frame. Another feature that I really liked is that when you're in manual focus, it still uses face detect. So the way this works is you'll go into manual focus and you'll still see the yellow box around faces or human subjects. You can select between them. And then what it allows you to do is when you punch in for critical focus, it goes straight to the person's face, not just the middle of the frame. So this is extremely useful if you're using manual focus and let's say you're shooting people. The ZF also features 5-axis image stabilization, or as Nikon calls it, vibration reduction, on the sensor, which gives us an 8-stop increase on shutter speed possibilities for handheld shooting. Continuous shooting with the mechanical shutter is 14 frames per second. You can go to 30 frames per second if you use the electronic shutter. The shutter speed dial is pretty much exactly like what you see on cameras like the F3, the FM, the FE. We also have dials for exposure compensation as well as ISO settings. Another nice detail is the shutter release, and you kind of have to feel this in person to know what I'm talking about. But what's really cool is it feels exactly like using an older camera. It even has a threaded cable release socket on it. A lot of attention was put into the details on this, and it really is cool. And while a subdial isn't exactly a retro feature, this does have a retro function. So we have a subdial here for your mode selection switch. So we can go between stills mode, video mode. There's a dedicated black and white mode, which is very cool if you just want to flip over in between color and black and white if you're shooting JPEG images, let's say. The camera also allows for pixel shift shooting to create images up to 96 megapixels, and you can select between 4, 8, 16, or 32 raw NEF files to create the composite. Video on this camera is pretty much what you would expect from a non-stacked CMOS sensor in 24 megapixel variety. You can shoot 4K video oversampled from 6K up to 30p, as well as 4K 60, but if you're in crop mode or DX mode. Internal log recording is supported on this camera, unlike the Z6 or the Z6 II. The camera uses a 3.6 million dot OLED viewfinder with 0.8x magnification. The monitor is a fully articulating type with a 3.2-inch 2.1 million dot touch-enabled LCD screen. So a few observations from my somewhat limited time with this camera. So I shot all day on this thing and I used exactly 2 lenses, and this was my favorite part. One of the lenses that I used was the Nikon Z 40mm f2 lens, which is sort of a pancake super compact lens. I have to say this, I'm not normally a big fan of pancake or compact lenses because I feel like there's a trade-off with image quality. However, I was pleasantly surprised with the Nikon. The 40mm f2 is an awesome lens, and it really really complements this camera because it keeps the package really small, like what you would have in an actual retro camera. So that was pretty cool. The other lens that I wanted to use, and I was really dying to try that, since it's a retro kind of configuration, I wanted a retro look on the lens. One of my favorite lenses that Nikon has ever made. This is the 58mm Noct f1.2. This version is probably from around 1978 or so. It's one of my favorite lenses ever. That has such a unique look that you're not going to get on anything else. You can stop it down to clear up aberrations and stuff, but wide open it is just absolutely beautiful. And it did just fine on this lens. I just used the standard FTZ adapter that Nikon makes for the Z series of cameras, and I shot pretty much most of these images on this lens. It was one of my favorite lenses, and it did not disappoint on the ZF. So one of the comments that I want to make is on the actual image quality that you're getting on the RAW files. I actually was able to shoot RAW files and have not only the Nikon Studio software read them, but also Lightroom, which was a surprise. Normally new cameras, when they come out, you can't read RAW files until they're actually updated. But looking at the RAW files on this camera, this is some of the best imaging I've seen on any Nikon camera to date. Some of this may have to do with the fact that we have a 24 megapixel backside illuminated sensor, but it does really well in low light. The high ISO performance is actually very impressive as well. One of the problems that you have with digital cameras, when you get into higher ISOs over 64 or 12,800 and you get into that zone, you start getting a lot of color noise and a lot of noise in general. And I thought that the Nikon handled these extremely well. In fact, I think it handled them maybe even a little bit better than what I was able to get with the Z8 and the Z9. And that's not a slam against those cameras. It's just, I think there's something special about this camera in terms of the quality you're getting. I also really like the contrast definition that was coming off the RAW files. Nikon tend to lean on the contrasty side. And of course, if you're shooting RAW, this is something that you can go dial in however you want. You can reduce contrast very easily in image editing software, but they came in just slightly less contrasty than normal, and it was very controllable. And of course, using a vintage lens with many of these shots, I did want to get more of a film look in post-production to complement the look of the older optics that I was using. So a few years ago, I actually started developing a set of presets that I could use to replicate the looks of older film stocks for digital files, and that's what you're seeing me use in this video. I started this by emulating the various looks of Kodak slide films like Kodachrome or even the C41 emulsions such as Portra. After I had developed a set of 16 film emulsions that I really liked, I started working with Fujifilm stocks. So I ended up making emulsion simulations for Provia, Velvia, Astia, and even some of the older stuff that's no longer made, such as Natra. I adapted both of these presets to both Lightroom and Capture One, and last year I decided to make them available for anyone who wants to check them out. I'll put a link in the description of this video if you want to try them for yourself. Typically, I apply the film look that I want to have, and then I adjust the white balance to make sure that's correct. And these are pretty sensitive, as film stocks have a very specific contrast to them. But once that's dialed in, these pictures are pretty much good to go, and this speeds up my workflow considerably. It gives me the look that I'm after. If we look at some of these images though, particularly the ones that I shot in the jazz club, so this is very low light. It's a basement jazz club. It's very cool, has a great vibe to it. And you can see here, and I did a lot of various testing with higher ISO settings, and the camera performs very beautifully. Now, one thing that's interesting about this camera, and we've started to see this with a lot of cameras that have rolled out in the last couple of years, is when we have improvements with in-body image stabilization, it opens up possibilities. You can handhold your shots at much lower shutter speeds, and so that's one thing that's really cool. The other thing that's cool is you can go with a lower shutter speed. You don't have to be wide open on the lens all the time, so if you need that depth of field, you can also stop down. But the other interesting side effect of all this is that sometimes you're able to handhold at a speed that is so slow that you're getting a lot of motion blur, whether it's wind in a tree or somebody moving in the frame. So it becomes more susceptible to that. So that's why higher ISO is still very important in a camera. It's really cool to see that the ZF has them both. Another thing that I'd like to point out with the ZF, so forget the retro styling for a second and just look at the fact that we've got a 24 megapixel camera. And what does that mean? Well, this camera does come in at a very interesting price point. It is just under $2,000 US. I think it is a much better camera than what we have with the existing Z6 cameras. So the Z6, the Z6 II. I think those were very good for what they were. They were early on in Nikon's move to mirrorless. Even I say that, it was just a couple of years ago. But they were kind of version 1 and version 2 of that camera. And this camera I would not think of as an extension to the Z6 at all. It is its own thing. Plus, it has the retro styling, which I personally kind of like. The reason I think the retro design is really cool is, well, this has a lot to do with where I came from as a photographer, but I want to share this with you. So this is my ancient Nikon F3. This was my main camera for a number of years, and it shows it's pretty worn. But I love this camera, and I did a review on this years and years ago, early on in my channel, because it was a camera I was still using. And, you know, we're dealing with a film camera here. This was pre-autofocus, and so a lot of the limitations on this camera are there, and it is a little bit crude in its design. So it's manual focus. You're going to twist the lens to focus. You twist the aperture ring to set the aperture, and you can set your shutter speed manually, but you could also put this in automatic, so it's pretty much stuck in an aperture priority mode when you do that. So you have two choices, aperture priority or manual priority. And of course, the ISO is set and determined by the film speed. So one of the things that I said in that review that far back is that there was something that I missed on digital cameras. Back in the DSLR age, we still had some knobs and buttons to a degree, but there was still a lot of diving down into computer menus. And I always wanted a digital camera that had the simplicity of my F3 or even my FE2 that I used as a backup, but it was digital and it was modern. And with the Nikon ZF, I think we finally got that. It offers way more options than that, but I love the way that Nikon designed this camera from a user interface standpoint. Everything's easy to use. It's very simple. I love just being able to put a manual focus lens on it, and this is the kind of shooting that I like to do. And it's the kind of stuff that just, I don't know, as a photographer, it's the tool that I want for the job that I have. Now, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this camera to somebody who needs a high-speed camera for sports, for wildlife, something like that, where you need just a high burst rate of shooting. This camera is not that. And I would also say that while I thought the video quality was outstanding, it's going to depend on your needs there too. If you're just shooting stuff like I am for YouTube and you're just doing talking head stuff and you don't need a lot of high speed, it's probably more than adequate. However, if you want 60 frames per second and you don't want to be able to crop, or if you want to be able to shoot even 120 frames a second, it's going to be limitations that are on that 24 megapixel sensor, and it has to do with the scan speed of the CMOS, but it's not going to achieve what you want it to do there. But for most of us out there who don't necessarily have those requirements, or somebody who wants to do a lot of photography and maybe they want to do some video, I think this is an awesome choice. And I've stated my case with the retro thing, and if you guys have seen my videos before, you know I'm a gigantic vintage lens nerd, and so to be able to put my old Nikon F lenses on a camera that kind of looks the part and feels the part, more importantly, it was something that was really outstanding and special to me. I would really love to do a full review on the Nikon ZF, so stay tuned and we'll see if I can get to that. And I would love to know what you guys think, so drop me a comment below. I'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.